Well, I'm Camille Randall, and I probably a lot of you guys might recognize me from Hope a few years ago. I am at Hope again, leading up our diagnostic centers. And one of the things that has come up in our discussions as diagnosticians and as people working with a lot of families of younger children is, what is appropriate screen time? I know Denise Daly, was particularly concerned about some of the screen use she was seeing in her young clients and, started to do some research about like what are the recommendations currently, because I think there's a lot of miscommunication, a lot of misinformation, and there's a lot of things that are accurate. Um, in terms of my own background, I think I'm most familiar with screen use in middle school aged and teenagers, but this has been a really interesting, foray for me to learn more about like how this applies to younger kids under 5. So basically, I had a couple questions as we were getting started. What are the benefits of having children under 5 have screen time? What do you worry about their screen use under 5? And I want to talk about what the current recommendations are, particularly from the American Academy of Pediatrics. So, talk about screen limits right now, and then also, what are the true risks that we're seeing based on research, and then what seems to be excessive concern, given how pervasive screen time is in our society of all ages. And then finally, I always like to be practical, like, well, what do we do to make sure that kids are accessing screens in inappropriate ways? And then also, what do we do without a screen, especially if we're starting to become dependent on screens to distract kids or help soothe them when they're frustrated. So, so that was in the discussion. We'll be talking about a lot of these things, and at the end, I've got some extra time if we want to discuss these things more. Um, so recommended screen limits at this time. So first of all, I'm taking a developmental lens in our presentation today, thinking about like what are kids trying to accomplish in the early years. For infancy, birth through 2 years, they're trying to develop secure attachments, secure relationships that bond with their caregivers. They are developing all kinds of language, not just verbal, but also communicating need, communicating wants, expressing affection, learning how to respond to gaze. They're doing all kinds of things language-wise and communication-wise. Physical skills. I mean, I had a really busy kid in my office the other day, and the parents were like, "We are so sorry." I said, "You know what? He's 2. This is how he explores the world. He's moving around, he's touching everything, he's putting his hands in things, just like, okay, that's fine. We just got to keep an eye on these things um, and whatnot." So they're developing the physical skills to explore and learn. They're starting to learn how to self-soothe, to sleep through the night. And then also back and forth play is really important for kids to learn. And then also, again, for, social interaction and forming those bonds with their loved ones. So 2 years through 5 years, kind of the toddler preschool years, there's more advanced skills in terms of cooperative back and forth play, learning a lot of social skills through that, learning patience, learning negotiation skills at their age. Again, kids are a lot more verbal in general, a lot more talkative, but also they're developing social pragmatic skills. And that is, looking at people's faces to try to assess, what's the mood in the room? How's this person feeling? Is my parent angry with me? Is my parent, laughing at something I said? So they're developing a lot of the nonverbal skills as well as verbal skills, which requires a lot of back and forth and a lot of, visual interaction. And then also, kids 2 through 5, they're trying to master new skills by themselves. They're trying to figure out how things work. I love working with kids, and if they've got, like if one of the Lego structures, they're trying to build is falling apart, and they're trying to think, okay, like what piece do I put on here to make this more stable so it won't fall apart? And, I love seeing their problem solving. And so, again, this is something that's very important for development at this age. Finally, they're learning to use words to describe their feelings and regulate their feelings through the use of words or the use of skills to calm down if they're upset. And then finally, there's a lot more understanding of what is meant to educate. It's not quite as passive viewing, but they're also, seeking information to learn from it. So in terms of understanding educational content, that's developing across the preschool years. Um, so in terms of screen use, rather than go for a specific limit, like, oh, this amount is too much, this amount is just right, The American Academy of Pediatrics is looking for, okay, we have to understand these 5 C's about individuals. So for infancy through 2 years, we're trying to say, okay, what is the particular child's needs? How do we help them self-soothe without being overly dependent on media to do this, which is, listening to songs on their parents' phone, to have, apps, cartoon apps, to prevent boredom if they're in a waiting room or something. So, really looking at what are the child's particular needs. For content for infancy, video chats with family are probably okay. They probably understand that that's grandma, like, okay, we're laughing, we're giggling, we're singing songs. But really, in terms of their ability to learn through media, it's pretty limited in the early years. Maybe some programming that's specifically developed based on research about kids' attention spans in the early ages, maybe PBS Kids or Sesame Street might have some benefit. But really, under 2 years, kids are not looking at apps or screen time to really learn from it. Again, because of the importance of self-soothing skills, particularly at bedtime, um, you know, really we're not wanting to use media to soothe. Instead, we're wanting to use physical closeness, we're wanting to use rapping, maybe some quiet music, singing, lullabies, maybe looking at picture books together. But really it's the human interaction that's going to help with the self-soothing and also, other forms of, learning how to regulate emotions at the early years. Crowding out is another one of the 5 C's, and that is, what is screen time displacing? And so screen time for kids under 2 displaces speaking, that back and forth interaction with parents and play. It displaces co-reading in terms of reading picture books, again at night to try to regulate sleep initiation. And then also building predictable routines to where this is the time that we do this, this is the time we do that. And I think sometimes if screens are used overly for distraction or for entertainment, then that interrupts predictable routines. And then finally, if kids are of that age are viewing any kind of screen, it's very important that parents and caregivers and teachers are doing that with them. They're discussing, they're labeling, labeling pictures of animals, labeling feelings, labeling what they see. But also, if there are preferred songs, which most kids do have, songs that they've learned from shows and movies and things that they watch with their families. But also, if they're viewing those songs on media, make sure that the families are also singing that in your own voice as well. Finally, how the 5 C's apply to the toddler years and preschool years. Children are starting to develop more of their personality. Some are going to be very, very active and impulsive. Other kids are maybe more cooperative and, are more adaptable when it's time to set limits and say, okay, no more screens. So really understanding how your child interacts with screens is important because, some kids might need a lot more structure around screens, whereas some kids are a little bit more go with the flow and like, okay, yeah, fine, I'll give this up because, I can draw instead. Or, yeah, I understand it's time for bed. I'll go get my blankie and my jammies on and read a book. Content, again, kids are starting at this age to have more benefit learning from educational content. And that is, facts about animals, facts about the world, healthy behaviors, emotion regulation, cooperation, understanding diversity. I'm just kind of thinking about Mr. Rogers and Sesame Street and, Miss Rachel, like, all of the programming intended for kids this age, kids can actually benefit from it. And so I think it's important for parents to think, okay, what is my child interacting with? And even during times that, we're using media to, regulate on long car rides, or if we're waiting at the doctor's office, are we watching something that's educational or something that, which I'll get into later, might not be the best thing for kids to model or pattern their own behaviors after. And it's important at this age that caregivers are still modeling emotion regulation. They're still trying to remain calm in frustrating situations, and also, using words to describe feelings. I was doing an assessment during a tornado warning a couple of weeks ago, and the mom was doing a great job. The kid was crying and saying he was scared, which I was too. We were all in this closet feeling scared, but the parent did a really great job saying, I understand you're scared. This is, difficult. It's difficult for mommy too, but why don't we just hug each other? And I thought, for the 3 of us being inside of this small room, it was really nice how the mom was modeling, calming, soothing behaviors for this young child. Um, and then, reserving use for screens outside of recommended times for, again, long car trips, waiting at the doctor's office, occasional, maybe if kids are getting overwhelmed at big family gatherings, knowing your child, kind of going back to number one, saying, okay, it's fine, here, take my tablet and go watch, Bluey for a little while, but then come, I'll come get you in about 20 minutes or so. So, parents are having to be really cautious about extra use in kids. And again, what are screens crowding out? It's crowding out playing, it's crowding out physical activity, it's crowding out being in nature, looking at books for pre-literacy skills, and also just social chatting, just like hanging out and just kind of again picking up on those no nonverbal cues and back and forth, conversation, a lot of the things that we look for. And then also if parents are watching content with their kids, again, labeling, what's appropriate behavior. Maybe there might be some things in some cartoons for kids that, um, I don't like to use the word bad, but some things are inappropriate or some things you might think, well, if Oscar the Grouch did this, what do you think would happen next? And you want to kind of model, if then thinking about some of the less attractive behaviors. And then also, if kids are seeing something in media, maybe Bert and Ernie are coloring on the sidewalk with sidewalk chalk. Well, that might be something that parents can say, hey, you want to go outside and color on the sidewalk, so they can pick up on what kids are watching and actually do those things in real life as well. Okay, so just kind of getting into signals and noise. Again, what are the true risks of excessive screen use in kids? There's a lot more known about older kids and teenagers right now. I think, I think the most research has kind of attended to this, but we're also starting to see more results in younger people. I think there's a lot of educational research that kind of talks about, what happened during COVID online learning, and uh, there's some discrepant, math and reading and literacy skills as a result of, a couple of years of lost in-person learning. And so really, we have to be careful, like what does media get in the way of? And again, it supplants self or parent mediated soothing. Excess media has difficulty with sleep initiation and regulating sleep, especially with, what we know about blue lights and arousal levels at night. Attention regulation, pre-literacy skills, learning how to interact with books and printed media, looking at pictures, like the books and printed media are a lot kind of slower versus screens, which are a lot faster, have a lot of visuals, have a lot of movement. And so we want kids to be used to interacting with things that are a little bit more organic, I guess. And then also, excess screen use gets in the way of emotional awareness because you're not having that in-person interaction to where you're learning to really pick up and respond to nonverbals. And then just some, brief implications for neurodiverse kids. A lot of times, and this isn't true for every single child that's on the spectrum, but think about how literal they can be. What they see is maybe what they believe. Echolalia. I know we had a student a few years ago that would watch this German thing called Leopold, and he would just completely echo everything he heard from this, Leopold character, and it was jarring, and so you want to be careful as a parent and as an educator, what are kids watching? Sometimes being perseverative or rigid about, like wanting their screen or becoming very dependent on it for self-soothing. But on the other hand, the ability to have screen time to motivate non-preferred tasks can be helpful. We know that AAC devices are very important in actually helping kids learn to communicate better. And then, in the clinic here, I see the staff interacting with kids and they are interacting. There's a lot of co-regulation that happens around the kids' AAC devices. So, I mean, I think I don't have to talk to this audience. There's a lot of benefits from screen use for kids that are trying to acquire more communication and more language. And then also kind of interesting, but assessment-wise, the Vineland has questions on there about does the child know how to turn on media? The ADOS has a little toy phone that we judge whether or not the child picks it up and tries to talk into it. So there's some understanding even amongst these developmental measures that we use that kids are going to interact with screens, and that's an important part of their development, which I think is kind of interesting. It's just we have to moderate that. And then also with ADHD, just to be careful that a lot of times, they're highly attuned to reinforcement, sensation seeking. And so, children with ADHD might be more prone to de becoming dependent on screens and might be more impulsive trying to access them. But also, again, you compare high motivation with low motivation tasks academically. And I think the origins of false alarms, and I've got to be mindful of time. The origins of false alarms, I think there used to be very rigid recommendations from the American Academy of Pediatrics to say, okay, no more than half an hour when you're younger, 2 hours is about the limit for older kids. And, teenagers across the universe were saying, oh my gosh, this is awful. This doesn't match what our regular life is like. But I think really with younger kids, we've got a lot more control over what they see and how much they see. And then, as always, I think advances in technology always happen before we really understand what the true implications are. I think back in the 80s, video games were going to make us all psycho killers, and, for the most part, we're not. So, just kind of keep in mind that there's always kind of advances in technology before we really understand like what the implications are. And, it's ripe for a lot of people being alarmist, and sometimes it's ripe for people being accurate. And I think, just some things I hear from parents is like, oh no, sometimes my 3-year-old actually watches about 1 or 1.5 hours. Am I a bad parent? Like, what am I doing wrong? I had an evaluation the other day to where, I can just imagine that parent saying, look, anyone can tell me not to have my kid watch, an episode of his favorite show during dinner, but otherwise he's not going to eat unless he's distracted. So, you try to get some protein in my kid. I don't know how. And this might be a parent that's, not participating in occupational therapy yet, or, needs some support about these things. So, you know, again, I think parents trying to use screens judiciously, even though it might not be perfect recommendations. Another family that is wanting their child to interact with their cousins, that, they don't have a lot of kids their age around. And because of the family schedule, they only go to daycare a couple of times a week. And so, they really want their child to play games, age-appropriate games, because it helps them learn to know their cousins, compromise, maybe accept not winning, problem solve in a game. And so they can see some social benefits actually from having screen use. And then I think, there's a lot of things saying that any screen use is going to make kids, dopamine fiends and get addicted to these devices. And also just to caution, we grew up with stuff. We grew up with, watching TV, DVDs, gaming as well. And I think our parents hopefully did a good job moderating our use as well. So I think this thought that we can't limit screens for kids, we can, and we can do it smartly. So, just in terms of setting limits, I think the recommendations is have a family media plan, discuss in advance how you want your children to access screens, use timers or other controls to monitor how much screen use is being accessed. I had an assessment yesterday to where the child kept on trying to get in the mom's purse to get her phone. And so, I think having, like zipping up the purse, maybe putting the purse underneath your chair at home, not having it just out and about like on the kitchen counter, to have it not be visible for kids just to want it at all times. Again, use screen time judiciously to reinforce non-preferred activities. Parents need to model their own use of screens. Like if it's expected that we're going to have a nice conversation at dinner time, then if the parent has their phone like right next to them is always checking or, picking it up every time there's a notification, then that's not modeling for their kids appropriate screen time. And then, again, outside of typical times, what is okay? What is the purpose of the screen use? And again, being careful that it's not supplanting self-soothing. So, long car trips, perfect. I mean, I think for years, minivans have had, the screens built into the seats and stuff for a reason. Then also, if you're in an atypical environment, medical procedures, anything to where, it's just outside of the child's typical situation, you can incent kind of like, okay, this is a special time, you can have your tablet. And just remember, it's always easier to add media privileges as kids get older than to take them away once they become problematic. And that's why the family media plan is really important to have. Um, this kind of 5-finger exercise was born out of a client that I had that got grounded from screens for 2 months because of I think they had maybe bought some stuff on Amazon using I don't know. It was a long story, but basically they got in huge trouble. And so the question is, well, what do we do instead? And, this person was asking it earnestly, what do we do instead? And so as I was describing, like, okay, what do we do instead? I kind of thought, okay, here's five general categories. What can we do socially, IRL? What can we do physically or outdoors? And this is specific for every single child. It's not, a one size fits all. What are we learning right now? What are we practicing? What can we do to help ourselves or help others? What's something creative we can do? So there's a lot of different alternatives. And also I'll go into the next slide, how these support development. And some activities definitely double dip. So if you're decorating cookies with your grandparents, that's both social and it's also creative. And maybe helping self, maybe helping learn how to cook or learn how to, stir, or if you're actually making the cookies. And then if you're trying to find as many different kinds of leaves as you can on a nature walk, you're outside, you're talking with a parent or a caregiver, you're learning something about the different shapes and different colors. So, there's a lot of things that double dip. And so, social, it goes without saying, but you're helping develop perspective taking skills, you're developing cooperation, you're developing connection with others, but it also goes both ways. And I'm also thinking about parents. I've had a lot of assessment clients recently to where their parents say, okay, if our child's on the spectrum, we want to understand the way she thinks. And, what better way to do that than have a lot of close bonding time to where you're doing things together. Physical outdoors, of course, is good for mood regulation, coordination, general health, attention regulation. Again, some of those slower things rather than the fast, rapidly rewarding aspects of screens. Learning and practicing something, which is, obvious, like it's good to learn and practice thing, but it also is building early executive skills, curiosity, and also language development. Helping self and others, it develops, of course, adaptive skills, the things that are important to develop that sense of agency across childhood, but also is building healthy habits, empathy, and a sense of agency, like, hey, I can do stuff. My parents trust me to put my laundry in the hamper and take it downstairs. And, as a 4-year-old, even though it's a chore, I feel like I know how to do stuff and my parents trust me. Then creative, promotes mental flexibility, problem solving, emotion regulation. And then also all of these in real life activities promote adaptability, tolerance for transitions, and then also tolerance for less stimulating activities, because, there are those dopamine bings that happen when you're, with a screen a long time. And oh my gosh, I got through it all in my allotted time. And I just want to kind of thank you for your attention. And if there are any desires for follow-up, or if you want to stay online to kind of chat about these topics or talk some more, I am available. Yeah. So, whoops, where'd I go?
So I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but if you have any, feel free to go ahead and drop them in.
I was really worried that I wouldn't be able to get all through all my content. So I'm sorry if I went kind of fast on a couple of those things. Yeah, well, I saw where Kelly had mentioned, the benefits would be educational apps, which I think is apt, just making sure that it's age appropriate for what the child can actually understand. And I think there's a lot of good things for, children on the spectrum too, in terms of, emotion, feelings, faces, and things like that, that a lot of times you can have on, flashcards, but also there's apps that do that. And then also I think some other folks mentioned, okay, what's appropriate content, and parents absolutely have to monitor what their kids are watching. Um,
I think for me, one of the concerns I always have is what does it do to your imagination?
mhm.
Because I'm old. We didn't,
Mhm.
I had TV. There was no VHS. There was no DVD. I didn't even have cable growing up. So there was a lot of imaginative play. And I think some of the screen time takes away some of that quiet space where the imagination lives.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. And I think, we can't deny that screens exist, but we also need to make sure that kids are practicing those slow things. Sitting down with a bunch of, paper and things to make a collage or markers and, just kind of figure out like what colors do I want to go together? Like, ooh, I don't think I like the way this looks. I'm going to start over. And, having that sense of patience. I mean, I think there's a lot of, again, the creativity, executive functioning skills that happen with these slower activities.
One person did ask, Melissa asked, if there was any way you could share the slideshow. If you're okay with it, I'm happy to put that up on the intranet for people
Yeah,
to.
I don't think there's anything super proprietary in there. Like my five finger exercise, I don't plan on patenting that or copywriting that or anything. So, and then a lot of the other information, came from resources that are publicly available, especially the American Academy of Pediatrics. So yeah, I
Okay,
don't think
so
it's,
yeah,
yeah.
we will get the video of the presentation and we'll go ahead and put the PowerPoint deck up on the intranet and people can view and download from there.
Yeah, and there's a couple of slides in there that are just kind of like placeholders, so I'll edit it a little bit. So yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm not seeing any questions come through, so I think at this point we're probably okay to go ahead and stop. Pardon me, we're gonna stop the recording right now.